This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 40. With me today, as always, is Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tolan. And this week, we're going to talk about autonomous unconscious complexes. What do you make of that, Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tolan? Well, the sound of it is very sophisticated. It evokes the early 20th century fetishism with the unconscious, made popular by Sigmund Freud, but adopted by Carl Jung. And in our times, it sounds like a very mysterious, almost Victorian concept. That's true, but that's what maybe a normal person would think of it. But you are a Jungian depth mystic. Aren't you a little more comfortable with that phrase than maybe the average modern person? You are right, podcast host Zach Tolan. I actually spent my time learning everything that Carl Jung said. And one of the results is that I feel comfortable. I basically understand what he means when he talks about autonomous unconscious complexes. But today, I would rather get specific. We're going to talk about one of my own unconscious complexes. Very powerful experience that I'd like to talk about. By all means, proceed. So this week's been pretty busy for me. And toward the end of it, I was working on an aspect of my video game. And then I was told to freeze. I was out on a walk, and I'm sort of doing a brainstorming session. And then I wanted to go home. But as I turned home, my body shivered. My body froze, and I became aware of something I'm very familiar with by now, which is that sometimes my body knows more than I do. And so I immediately stopped going home and started to wonder, okay, so what does my body want from me right now? There might be many ways in which an autonomous unconscious complex can manifest itself. But in my case, I'm very familiar with when this thing makes my body do certain things. I might want to go to the right, but my body wants to go to the left. And I've learned how to subdue myself and to allow it to take over, basically. This is interesting. Maybe you could tell us the history of this complex that you're talking about. So when I was 23, I had dived deep into the hero's journey, and I had been called insane because I was behaving in ways that were incompatible with society. And yet these ways were necessary for me to grow. And so I learned how to understand that there's a difference between what I need to do and how society might want me to behave. But at about that point, I had one of the most profound dreams that I've ever had. A dream. That's pretty Jungian. Now, Jungians take dreams extremely seriously, obviously, right? Well, yeah. It almost goes without saying that if you're a Jungian, you're going to take your dreams seriously. They are messengers from the unconscious, after all. There you go, that phrase, the unconscious. I think we'll have to dive into that today. Yeah, the unconscious is central to this whole issue that I'm bringing up. The idea of the unconscious. Factually, it is anything you're not conscious of. And one important distinction to make is that the unconscious is an adjective, normally. Like, did you see the red light as you were speeding through it? Well, no, I didn't see it. I was unconscious. Were you aware that somebody broke into your house last night? Well, no, I was not aware. I was sleeping. I was unconscious. This is an adjective describing your degree of awareness at a given moment. But this little fetish that Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung adopted was to give the unconscious a kind of personality. They called it the unconscious. They turned it into a noun. That's interesting because as soon as you turn the unconscious into a noun, you're getting into that zone of that phrase, the autonomous unconscious complex. Right. Talking about the unconscious as if it's a separate entity from the conscious person is endowing it with a kind of autonomous spirit. It's like its own thing. Even referring to it as the unconscious is saying that the unconscious itself is an autonomous unconscious complex. But it's not an autonomous unconscious complex, it's the unconscious. Is it not something different from that? Well, yeah, I would say it's the autonomous unconscious complex par excellence. The sum total of all your unconscious complexes is described when it's called the unconscious. And it means there's a separate personality apart from your conscious self that is nonetheless a part of you. Yeah, and not everybody talks about the unconscious. Other people, they might even care about what their dreams were, but they won't refer to it as the unconscious. So it turns out to be actually a pretty sophisticated cognitive operation that allows somebody like Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud to recognize that you can imagine all of the unconscious factors as one thing, that you can conglomerate them and say the unconscious will produce a dream or a vision or a serendipitous, synchronistic experience. It's as if you have to have so much experience with the limitations of consciousness to start imagining the unconscious as one unified ocean of stuff that isn't you, or at least not consciously. The key Jungian distinction is realizing that who you are is only partly conscious. And Jung realized many modern people, without even knowing it, which is to say unconsciously, they unconsciously assume that their consciousness is the entirety of who they are. They identify their consciousness with their whole self. And one of the key principles of the whole psychoanalytic movement, starting with Sigmund Freud and then amplified and expanded by Carl Jung, is that your whole self includes this other thing, which is to say a unified conglomeration of many different things. And then they call it one thing, the unconscious. And your whole self is your consciousness plus your unconscious, plus your body, plus whatever people think of you in the world. That is your whole self. Okay, that's really cool. But you were going to tell us about your own unconscious complex. Yeah, so I had this really powerful dream. I was a military officer, and I was training a bunch of troops. And then I had a vision of 3 boxes with a line connecting them at the bottom. And inside each of those 3 boxes was a triangle. And I was told that soon I would be visited by the Savior of the world. Shortly, the day came, and we had to go on this mission. The mission required us to go to the area where the hang gliders were and to take the hang gliders into a dark forest. Right at the end of the pathway towards the hang gliders, there was a standing statue of a wooden man smiling. He was kind of like a ventriloquist dummy. And he was just standing next to the path, smiling as if to guard the exit. Just a statue, basically. A wood-carved statue. Then we took the hang gliders, and we arrived at like a rundown fort that was covered with stuff and had to be cleaned up. But at the fort, there were 3 doors, each with a circular window in them, a perfect parallel to the 3 rectangles with the triangles in it. So I recognized I was now at the location where the ominous event would occur. And there was a Mexican guy helping us. It became pitch black. And he said he heard footsteps out in the darkness. So we turned the spotlight out into the darkness and we didn't see anything. Then we went back to paving the gravel so that more military people could arrive. But then the guy grew frantic and he said he heard footsteps again. And so we shone the light back out into the darkness. And in the gravel we were just paving, there was a giant wooden statue, 20 feet tall. It was the same guy, the same ventriloquist dummy, but he was lying in the gravel, face up, the way Han Solo was when he got frozen in carbonite. And when I saw him, I knew that he was the savior of the world. That's a pretty powerful dream. The world of dreams is so strange. The images that appear tend to be really surprising, and they touch on a psychic space that is actually pretty terrifying. Yeah, the dream was terrifying. You know, statues are frequent appearances in horror movies, and moving things that you never see them moving. But when you go to look, all of a sudden the thing is there, standing still, smiling at you, or another thing that appear in horror movies. But my main point is that this wooden man was the savior of the world, decided by the dream world, the unconscious, as it were. And just so you know, when I had embarked on the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, he's talking about being a hero and saving the world. So for me, the idea of saving the world was an active concern. I really have always wanted to save the world, ever since Joseph Campbell came into my life and made me think it was possible. But the idea that some weird statue of a wooden man would be the savior of the world must have been pretty surprising. Yeah, it was surprising, but that's what I love about the dream world. It's capable of producing images that continue to stimulate you long after you've had the dream. Trying to understand the mystery of what that wooden man meant to me has taken me 20 years. And they're 20 good years. So to have a dream like that is a really important sustaining mechanism. It's like, as long as you don't understand that dream, then there are things yet to learn and you don't want to take any drastic action. That's how important dreams can be. They can be sources of guidance. And they have to give you something paradoxical enough to sustain the kind of mystery that can constantly remind you that there's stuff you still don't understand. And that's what that wooden statue was. And I guess this wooden man symbolizes some kind of autonomous unconscious complex for you. Exactly, that's the connection between the topic of today and my own personal experience. And so what have you discovered about him since then? Well, I think the most important discovery was that Carl Jung researched a similar subject matter, and he found in the alchemists, the Latin alchemists, a high regard for this entity that they called the spirit Mercurius. The spirit Mercury. The spirit Mercury. Well, that's a planet, and that's a Roman god. And it's also quicksilver, the chemical element. The metal that's also a liquid. Yes, it's all of those things in alchemy. But more importantly, and this is why it's of interest to Jungians, is that the spirit Mercurius evokes a kind of symbol of a psychic factor, something in psychology. And in Jung's essay, The Spirit Mercurius, he says that the thing that the spirit Mercurius evokes is what Freud and Jung called the unconscious. It's as if the unconscious itself is such a true and vivid principle that it was known to the alchemists by way of their symbol, the spirit Mercury. That is really interesting because if the spirit Mercury appears in dreams and in alchemy as its own thing, and it represents the unconscious itself, it's as if the unconscious is creating a representation of itself. Yeah, and that is perfectly within the powers of the unconscious to do something like that. The unconscious could make a dreamlike statement which says, this represents me, the thing that's creating this dream. And here is the symbol, and here is the relationship of this symbol to other things. For example, in my dream, it was simultaneously a weird wooden statue that moved when you weren't looking at it, but also the savior of the world. I knew when I saw it that it was the savior of the world. And then later I realized that the alchemists also elevated their spirit Mercurius to that same level of being completely exalted. Like Mercury was akin to God in alchemy, generally speaking. They called him Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes is the Greek word for Mercury. And Trismegistus means thrice greatest. So there were three different ways in which they determine how good a thing is. And the spirit Mercury was the greatest in all three of those ways. They really got excited about the power of the spirit Mercury. And Mercury was essential, not just the chemical element. That is like small potatoes compared to what Mercury meant to these guys. What it meant was this power to take the original substance and finally arrive at the philosopher's stone. Sort of like the power of transformation. It's the idea that alchemy is even possible at all, that you can take one thing and transmute it into something else. And in modern psychological terms, it means that healing is possible, that you can take a wounded person and through psychological help, you can help them get better. So you can transform yourself. You can become like a Jedi Knight or a hero, is kind of what they're getting at. And Mercury is the spirit that allows that to happen. And that's, to my understanding, why they called it the thrice greatest. 3 times the greatest spirit. And it has different forms. You know, the prima materia is Mercury too. Like it starts out as Mercury and then it becomes a different kind of Mercury and then it becomes a different kind of Mercury. It's almost like the beginning and the end are somehow linked. But that's kind of a complicated thing. You know, alchemy is very vague. And it's a little complicated. Just like the unconscious. But anyway, my unconscious served me well. And it symbolized itself. And it told me that it was the savior of the world. And so this week, when I was frozen, when I was about to go home, and then this thing that I've become increasingly familiar with, it stopped me in my tracks and it told me to turn left and to stay put wherever I was. I was in the park where no one was. And I stayed there for a much longer period of time. And then the next day it did so again. That's just this morning. It sent me back to this isolated place and it just told me to stay there. And my conscious self had no idea what was going on. Or at least my conscious self had to let go because it knew that something else was in control. And so I've become a lot more familiar with this thing. And this morning I just gave him a new name. Mr. Unconscious. That's the wooden statue, the savior of the world. But his new name is Mr. Unconscious. You gave him a new name. That's pretty cool. You finally have a name for the savior of the world, wooden leprechaun, ventriloquist dummy that you believe, I guess, represents the same thing that the spirit Mercurius meant to the alchemists. And that it has something to do with the possibility of transformation, but that it's also elevating the unconscious, which is to say, elevating respect for the unconscious from the point of view of consciousness. On the one hand, the unconscious is kind of threatening. There's so many dark corners that could probably kill you if you let them into your consciousness in the wrong way. But it's a source of salvation as well. And the way you can access it is by believing that the things that come to you from unconscious places are actually really important. By caring about your dreams, you're elevating the status of the spirit Mercurius in your life. Okay, thanks for that Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan. Do you have any comments about the fact that it's episode 40? No, I mean, yes, it happens to be episode 40, but we're not doing anything biblical. We're not talking about the flood that lasted 40 nights and 40 days. We're not talking about the 40 days it took Jesus to ascend to heaven after being resurrected. It just happens to be episode 40. But this one, we're talking about the spirit Mercurius and the unconscious and autonomous unconscious complexes. Okay, that sounds good to me. And that's the end of this episode. There's a Facebook group and a Discord server. We will see you next week.